academic and research libraries in collaboration with EIFL, and what is mainly spearheaded by Iryna, Kuchma, the open access manager. So this workshop is geared towards librarians, faculty members, researchers, university administrators, and other officers from the grant and research. So this morning, you all know that the provision of research data management service is of increasing importance to academic libraries. And now many librarians play, and other research officers play some role in the provision of RDM services and related outreach and educational efforts. So at this webinar, we'll look at some few competencies in some areas which Iryna this morning is going to take us through. So this morning we have people from Ghana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Nigeria, and I believe that we will all enjoy ourselves. I'm Richard Bruce Lamte. I'm the country coordinator, EIFL country coordinator for Ghana. And I believe that this morning you're going to learn quite a lot on research management, data management services. Some few house rules. If you can kindly mute your speaker, if it's possible, and then if you have any question, you can put it on the Q&A. Or you want to introduce yourself to, you can also put it in the chat area. The presentation will be recorded. Everything is going to be recorded. So when we finish, you can have access to the recordings. Ladies and gentlemen, you are welcome. And in order not to waste time, I just want to introduce Iryna. Iryna is the EIFL Open Access Program Manager, and she's the one to take us through. Iryna, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Richard, and welcome, colleagues. I'll start with a short presentation, and then I hope we can have a discussion with those who are already providing research data management services in your libraries or plan to provide and have some questions. And as Richard said, let's use Q&A for questions, because then it would be easier to track and answer them. And you could also raise your hand after the meeting, because by default everyone is muted, but after my presentation, sorry, you could raise your hand and speak if you prefer speaking to writing. And let me share my screen. My slides are coming. Yes, I hope now you can see them. So I'd like to talk about a couple of topics that academic librarians should know about research data management and support they could provide to researchers. And I'll focus on key issues involved in managing research data, and I'll also talk a bit about benefits in following best practices in this area. And I'll speak from my perspective, which is based on events in Africa and Asia and Europe. And if you have other benefits that you usually use when you talk about research data management, please add to the chat, or we can discuss later on after my presentation. So usually academic librarians and researchers need to know how to manage and share research data, and that includes data protection and ethics, open licensing issues, and FAIR data principles. And FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. And also researchers need to know how to write data management plans, because those data management plans are required by many research funders these days. Usually when we do training events for researchers on research data management and also for librarians as trainers, we end up with takeaways listed on this slide and also a couple other slides. So we expect that researchers will understand which data they could make open and which data needs to be protected and can't be made open. Understand fair data principles, will be able to select which data to keep and find an appropriate repository for this data. Understand funder requirements on research data management, understand what personal data are and how researchers can protect them, what to consider when developing consent forms when data is collected in interviews, and those consent forms should be signed by people who participate in interview processes, for example, how to store data securely, how to anonymize data, also understand how to reuse data and how to select appropriate licenses for data that researchers want to make open. Understand how research data management helps with basic quality assurance, replicability, and reusability of research results, and also learn tips on how to get maximum impact from research data. And when we do trainings for researchers, we address why data management is important, what are the drivers, how data could be organized, documented, and described with appropriate metadata. We address data storage issues and backup, legal and ethical requirements, fair data principles, data sharing and reuse, long-term preservation, and responsibilities in research data management. And I'd like to start with this slide, stressing that data sharing doesn't necessarily mean open data sharing. Of course, we encourage open data sharing, but we understand that there might be circumstances in which data can't be shared, and those circumstances could be privacy requirements, legal issues, maybe some restrictions from project partners if this project is implemented with commercial partners, for example. So when we talk data sharing, it doesn't necessarily mean open data sharing. It could be data sharing in closed environment under certain conditions. But when we talk about data sharing, we mean sharing beyond a group of researchers involved in that particular project. And of course, we should understand that closed data will also exist if we talk about sensitive data, sensitive personal data, for example, commercially sensitive data. So it will never be possible to share all the data. And that's what most funders say when they require data sharing. They say as open as possible, as closed as necessary, because there will always be a need for keeping some data closed. When we talk about open data, we mean data which is online, free of cost, accessible, that can be used, reused, and distributed, provided that the data source is attributed. In some cases, data producers say that we don't even want attribution. You could use it without attributing us, but it's really a good practice to attribute the person who collected the data in case this data is reused. Tim Berners-Lee, who invented web, suggested a 5-star model for the web, which could also be applied to open data model. And when we talk about open data, minimum requirement is to have data available on the web in whatever format under open license. 2 stars is when this data is available as structured data. For example, Excel file instead of image scan of a table. 3 stars is when data is available in non-proprietary open format. For example, if CSV format is used instead of Excel, because CSV is an open format for spreadsheets. 4 stars if there is a URL that points to data. For example, if you put data in a repository, there is a persistent identifier, a URL, a handle that points to that data, or a DOI could be assigned to data to point to its location. And then 5 star is when data is linked with other research outputs, for example, publications, information about researchers who collected data, information about institutions where these researchers come from, information about projects, if this data was collected as part of the project. And this linked data is an ideal world for open data. I'd like to talk a little bit about rewards, why data should be open, and my disclaimer is that some examples come from Europe because I'm based in Europe. Apologies for that. Common argument is that sharing data is a part of good research practice. And some researchers say that if you publish journal articles only, and if you don't share your data, or if you don't provide access to your data, then it's almost like an advertising. So you can't really check their analysis and the results. And it's a good practice nowadays to publish papers with data, and more journals ask for data availability when research articles are submitted, and they encourage open data availability, but if not, at least data availability so that reviewers could have a look at data as well. It also helps to cut down on academic fraud, and there was a big case in the Netherlands. This professor whom you see on my slide was caught by his PhD student on falsifying data, and he was a professor of psychology, and he was writing about danger of eating meat. He was saying that people who eat meat are more selfish than people who don't eat meat, and other stuff. And then it turned out that for over 20 years, he was falsifying his data, and at least 30 articles were found in which he provided false data, and that was a big case in the Netherlands. Of course, professor isn't a professor any longer, and that was a big push for data management and sharing policies in Dutch universities to avoid cases like that. Another big example in Europe were austerity measures taken during economic crisis in the UK, also in Southern Europe, in some Baltic European states. And the report that suggested those strict austerity measures was based on a spreadsheet, and there was a mistake in that spreadsheet. And if that spreadsheet was available, and if that mistake, like simple mathematical mistakes, if that could be corrected, then maybe countries wouldn't suffer so much from strict austerity measures. So that's why more and more research funders push for research data management policies to avoid mistakes like that. And of course, as we see with COVID-19 research and also with research in other areas, open data availability helps to come up with new results quicker. Availability of data also increases citations of journal articles. So there was a study that confirmed that studies that provide access to underlying data are cited 25 more often than those that don't. So open availability of data also increases citations. And there are economic benefits. So for example, NASA saw economic benefits listed on this slide when they started making their satellite imagery data freely available on the net, because it really created a lot of jobs and opportunities for small and medium science companies. And another example is from European Bioinformatics Institute that the value of making data open is 20 times more than the funding that this institute receives. So it's also a good case for funders. And of course, with open data, you can make greater impact, avoid duplication of effort, because maybe someone else could just reuse your data, giving credit to you, preserve data for future researchers, and funders require data management practices. So the first website that academic librarians should know is this registry of research data repositories, res3data.org. And it's a place where researchers could search for data and find the data they could reuse, and also find repositories to make their data available if you don't have data repositories in your institutions or countries. And in this res3 data repository, you can browse by subject, by discipline. It's an alphabetical list of disciplines. Also browse by content type. So for example, if a researcher is only interested in images or scientific and statistical data formats or structured texts, and also browse by country. And I looked at Ghana, and there were 2 repositories registered here that researchers in Ghana could use, and you could also check for your countries. And if you don't have national data repositories yet, or institutional data repositories yet, I think you can find space for data in your institutional repositories for publications. Of course, it's not ideal, because the way you describe data is slightly different from the way you describe your publications. But I think if there are no other options, it might be a good practice for universities to start accepting research data in the institutional repositories. And of course, open data doesn't just happen. For that, you need data management planning, and that's what most funders require. So when they give grants to researchers, they require a certain degree of research data management. And usually researchers have to report in the form of data management plans. And these are documents that describe what data will be created, if any, and then format types, volume of data, whether standards and methodologies will be used for that, and how data will be documented, how ethics and intellectual property will be addressed, whether there is a plan for storage and backup, plans for data sharing and access, and also strategy for long-term preservation. And there are free online tools available for that to create data management plans. I'll show one of them, Argos. There is also DMP online tool, which is similar. And if you go there, you see a set of questions, and then you answer that set of questions and generate this data management plan. This Argos tool has some publicly available data management plans, and I want to show them to you. So it's a plan from researchers in the University of Ljubljana, and this project is a chemistry project, and it's funded by the European Commission. So you can see that they used a template from a funder, and they said that they will make the data available on Zenodo, which is a free shared repository for making data available. And they will also use GitHub for software. And here is a structure of this data management plan. So there is a data summary, answering a question, what is the purpose of data collection generation, and how it's related to project objectives, what types and formats of data will the project generate or collect, will you reuse any existing data and how. And for example, this project says that no data exists that can directly be reused. Then there is a question about origin of data, and researchers describe where the data come from, what is expected size of the data to understand storage requirements, to whom might data be useful, and they describe that academia and industry might find data useful and how. And then there is a section about fair data, whether they will use metadata to describe data, and they say that data will be uploaded together with related metadata. And they wouldn't use specific vocabularies for that, but it's a good practice to use specific vocabularies if they exist for disciplines. And they say that they will provide DOI, digital object identifiers, for data, and will provide documentation as well together with data. Usually it's a README file, text file that is uploaded together with data. And then there is a question whether open source tools exist for accessing data, and they say that they will make data available in open formats, but some proprietary files formats will also exist because that would add benefits and information to data that they create. And they say that there are no ethical or legal issues that can impact sharing data because it's chemistry, human subjects are not involved in research, and all data will be openly accessible on GitHub and Zenodo without any restrictions. And they will provide secure backup and recovery. They will license their data with Creative Commons attribution license, which is the most open license out of all open licenses. And they will document procedures for quality assurance of data. And then they will support for up to 5 years data reuse. So if another researcher would like to reuse their data, they will be answering questions, if any, about their data. And they use institutional infrastructure for making data available. And it's a responsibility of those two researchers who wrote data management plan to manage data, and they will make them available in university repository and also on Zenodo. And this slide describes these FAIR data principles: findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. And they were suggested in 2016 in an article in Nature, and have been really picked up all over the world. And what it actually means, it means that data has a persistent identifier like DOI or handle, rich metadata, searchable and discoverable online. Accessible means that it could be retrievable online using standardized protocols, and it's as open as possible, as closed as necessary, with appropriate descriptions, metadata, and under open licenses. Interoperable means that common formats and standards are used, and specific controlled vocabularies. And reusable means well documented with clear open licenses. And when open data started, there was this worry that if data will be shared early, then researchers could be scooped. And actually, it hasn't really happened, because when data is available, there is clear provenance information, so it's clear who made this data available, and it's always possible to trace back and prove that a researcher who shared data was actually the one who shared data, and it's her data, not someone else. So it actually helps to show authorship of data, and it helps with more transparent research. And there is a related movement to pre-register projects. Open Science Framework provides space where projects could describe their project intentions and maybe look for partners. And as we see with COVID-19 research, preprints sharing is very common, and there is a growing confidence that even unrefereed preprints could provide a lot of useful information, but of course should be treated as non-peer-reviewed publications yet. Another common misperception is that researchers have to keep and share everything, and of course it's never possible, because that's too much, and it takes a lot of time. Digital Curation Center suggested these 5 steps to follow to identify which data should be kept. And these are data that could be reused by other researchers, must be kept as evidence for the legal reason. For example, if this data underline a publication, then it's good to keep them in case a journal would ask. Should be kept for potential value. And then, of course, costs should be considered, because if it takes a lot of time to describe data and make them available, maybe it's really faster to collect new data sets. And based on those criteria, a researcher should make an evaluation which data to keep. These are the requirements from the European Commission, which is a main funder in Europe, and they say that projects should keep data needed to validate results in scientific publications. That's a minimum requirement, as well as associated metadata, who created this data set, what is the title of this data set, when it was made available, in which repository, whether there is an identifier. And This identifier is usually something that data repository would assign. Most data repositories assign DOIs to data, use handles. So researchers don't need to worry about that. And also European Commission requires sharing documentation and software if specific software is needed to access data. And this is basically everything that is needed to replicate a study, plus everything that is potentially useful to others. And it's always good if data is linked to other outputs, for example, open code, open workflows to collect data and come up with results. And this decision about data sharing is not a decision that could be taken by a researcher alone. It should be something that the researcher discusses with her collaborators, research participants if human subjects are involved in research, commercial partners if any. If data will be made available in a data repository, that repository requirements should be checked before data is made available. With publishers, if researchers already know where they would like to publish their paper, they should check what data sharing requirements that journal has and follow them. And then institutions might have research data management policies in place, like it's a case in South Africa, for example, and also funders might have data management policies that should be checked. So it's a collaborative decision on data sharing. And usually data is made open following these 4 steps. So a researcher decides which data set will be made available, an open license is applied, and Creative Commons attribution is a recommended license by many funders. Then data is made available in suitable format, open format preferably, in a repository, and then it's well described and discoverable. And if we look at this research data lifecycle, then the best approach is to have reuse perspective in mind when data is organized for sharing. So how other researchers that would like to reuse data would like to see this data organized. So start from this reuse perspective and try to have a clear structure for data, meaningful file names, use specific metadata for discipline or generic metadata formats for data. And there are directories for that, or tools for writing data management plans like Argos will suggest you. If you say that your area is chemistry, they would say in chemistry there are these standards for metadata. And it's important to address issues of storing data while project is still running and project team collaborates. But it's equally important to think about data archiving and preservation if it's worth doing so, and then make sure that this data is deposited in a digital repository and preserved. And think about open data sharing beyond project teams. So it's also good to start with the directory of data repositories that I mentioned in the beginning and check what are repository requirements for sharing data. And usually recommendation is to make data available in a discipline-specific repository, because that's where most researchers from that discipline come to look for data. Data could also be shared in institutional research data repository, if there is one, or space for data sharing could be made in institutional repository for publications. There are also cost-free data repositories such as Zenodo, Figshare, Dataverse, Harvard Dataverse, and some others. And res3data.org is a place where you can search for repositories. And when you search for repositories, it's always better to search for trustworthy digital repositories. And these are 3 standards that are used to certify repositories. So when you are in this registry of data repositories, you should check whether repositories are certified, because then it's more sustainable. And these are some of the slides about this free repository Zenodo, where researchers could share data, and it's really easy. So you log in, then you select upload, describe it, and make it available. And it's really a popular space for accessing data. For licenses, it's recommended not to use non-commercial and no derivatives licenses because they limit reuse. And funders in Europe recommend Creative Commons Attribution or Creative Commons Zero license. And there is also a wizard available which helps to select a license. So you just say it's a free wizard online, and you just answer, do you own copyright, and then whether you want to allow others to make commercial use of data or not. And then depending on the answers, a license will be suggested. And it's really helpful to have data management processes in place, because it makes research easier for researchers and also for future researchers. It helps to focus, helps to save data for later, avoid accusation of fraud or bad science. It helps to write data paper, because some journals, so-called data journals, allow publishing data as data papers, where where data sets are described, but they are not full-scale academic articles yet, because research process might be ongoing. And many of those data journals are really respected journals in academic world, and research institutions allow researchers to be promoted based on those data paper publications. And then, of course, it helps to share data for reuse and get credit for it. And I would like to end with an example of data management plan for PhD students, and that's a data management plan from University of Bath, and that's what we often use when we do trainings for early career researchers, because it's a simpler document than the one I showed before from a funder, and it describes how data will be gathered, how researchers will work with data, how data will be archived and shared, and who is responsible for implementing data. And that's a template that could be replicated if your institutions, if you don't have any yet. And we have some support materials available, and I'll also mention them. Later on. So we have this research data management handbook guide. We have specific guides on how to license data, how to deal with sensitive data. And we created short courses on managing and sharing research data, data protection and ethics, open licensing, use of open data in teaching, and it takes between 1 and 2 hours to complete a course. Assessing fairness of data. And when you complete a course, there are some questions that you have to answer as a quiz. And then after that, you'll receive a badge for completing this open data sharing course. And with COVID-19, it's really become obvious that early data sharing is important. And if your researchers are interested in COVID-19 related research, there is this collection of publications, research data, software, and other research on COVID-19, and most of it is openly available. And Zenoda also has coronavirus disease research community where data are shared, and it includes over 1,000 publications already. And we worked on specific guidelines and recommendations on COVID-19 data sharing in areas clinical, omics, epidemiology, social sciences. And that's a useful guide for your researchers. And then October is also a month of open access celebrations, because usually there is an open access week, which this year is October 19 to 25, and maybe open data could be a part of your open access week celebrations. So thanks a lot, sir. Now I'll check the questions, and I see two.
Thank you, Iryna. That's a good presentation. There's some few questions that maybe I may have to, so that I can take a breath. I mean, some few breath and then a few minutes breath, and then I can help you with the questions. And it says there's a question here. I said, please, can one publish paper from open data? If yes, what are the copyright issues, and how do one cite or attribute open data?
So if you're using someone else's data, then you have to check under which conditions this data were made open. So for example, if they used open licenses such as Creative Commons, and if they used Creative Commons attribution license, then you can reuse this data, you can publish this data, but there is a requirement to attribute a person who collected data. And if you want to make your data available, then you have to think whether you want to be attributed or not. And if you want, then you use attribution license. And then some other aspects, whether you want to allow modifications of your data, and that's desirable, because if I have a spreadsheet of someone else, and if I want to combine someone else's data with my data, I need to be able to make modifications and then share modified data. So it's always better if there is no restriction on modifications. And it's always better if data could also be used commercially, because with COVID-19 research, for example, we all want to have vaccine and treatment as soon as possible. So if we share COVID-19 related data with this non-commercial clause, then it means that it's not helpful in fighting this disease. But if you still want to insist on non-commercial use only, then you can use this non-commercial license. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. And there's another question where it says that in data reuse, can someone else research and use the data, and they use the same data that is shared with same population sample?
Yeah, I guess that's the whole point of data sharing. If I have population sample from Ukraine, for example, and if I want to check data for Nigeria, for same population sample, and do some comparative research, then open data sharing helps. But it also helps if data is described well, if it's clear who was an author of this data set, for me to attribute this author, and also if some descriptions are available, what different columns in spreadsheet mean if it's not obvious. So the answer is yes. and the request is to provide descriptions. Thanks, Moitz. I'll share slides and recording.
Another question from Ivan says that in a quantitative study, how long can a data set stay before it can be considered old?
I guess it depends on the type of research. I showed before that example from Moitz's University of Ljubljana, where researchers said that they commit to support data sharing for 5 years, because for them that's a reasonable period of time to reuse their data and also to allocate time to support reuses. But it might be a different period in other studies. And one of my favorite examples are diaries of salesmen about climate in 17th centuries, 18th centuries, which are used a lot now when researchers study climate changes. And those people who were writing diaries, those salesmen, they probably never expected their diaries to be used as data sets. So it really depends on the type of study and on the discipline.
Great. So it looks like there are no more questions. I'm not seeing any more questions here.
There is one about trust issues. Trust issues in data sharing is still a major challenge. How can academic librarians...
okay. That's okay. Last one. Okay. Okay. Trust. Okay. Trust issues in data sharing is still a major challenge. How can academic librarians encourage researchers to carefully manage and share their data? Coming from Fatima.
Thanks, Fatima. So I think a good way to start is to have sessions with researchers where data management plans, structures could be suggested for them, and suggest them to create those data management plans when they start their research project. Think whether they could reuse someone else's data, and this is where librarians could come and help, point into RESRI data repository or other places where data is available. Also think about data storage, especially if it's a sensitive data. It should be a secure data storage. And also think about making data available in a place where it will have maximum impact, and also document data well. If a publication will be written after this data collection, and if a journal would ask or would require some explanations or pointers to data, researchers should be ready to do that immediately. They wouldn't need to try to remember how they collected this data 3 or 5 years ago. So I think this careful data management is how researchers could assure quality of data, and academic librarians could guide researchers in this process.
There is another question. Thank you, Iryna. There's another question in the chat where it says that, is there any reason why one would not use metadata for describing data? What would be the consequences of not using metadata descriptors?
Well, unfortunately, the answer is yes. Many researchers don't describe. I manage COVID-19 community on Zenoda, and I see a lot of data sets which underline journal articles. And what researchers do, so they just upload a data set, and then they say, this data set includes finding presented in a journal article submitted to a journal, and sometimes they don't even say which journal article, what topic. And for me, as a community manager, I don't know whether it's COVID-19 data or not, because there is nothing about that in the description. And for other researchers who would like to reuse this data, they won't reuse it because information provided by researchers isn't enough. And I don't think it's because researchers don't want others to reuse data, but they don't think that descriptions are important. They just do something quickly. And I think here is a role for academic librarians, because they can explain that good metadata is really a way to make data discoverable by other researchers. And it's also beneficial to this researcher, because I don't think anyone will use poorly described data or won't even be able to find this poorly described data. And it's a shame, because the researcher shared this data, so it looks like there is an intention to share, but reuse potential is really low. But researchers still need a lot of education.
Right, Iryna, thanks very, very much. Plus, we're commending you for excellent presentation. Colleagues, I just want to tell you that the presentation will be shared, the video will be is recorded, and the video will also be shared. So you hear the voice and you have the presentation. For now, I don't know whether you've seen anything that, but I can't see any question anymore. I've gone through the chat and there's nothing there.
Thanks a lot, and we also answered all questions in Q&A. Oh, someone is raising a hand, so maybe let's.
All right.
So I can allow Rufa to talk if you want. You'll have to unmute yourself if you want to talk. Or if it was by mistake, then
right.
We can probably wrap up.
All right, so that it may be a mistake. Okay, so isn't a very good presentation, and the questions are all very good. I just want to say that I want to ask a question from my side, where for you to register in r3data.org, do you have to have a separate platform for your institutional repository and a separate platform for your data management, services or whatever?
I don't think there is a specific restriction about that, but you will have to provide information how you make this data available. So maybe they could ask if there is a specific data collection people could use, and then a URL to that specific collection will be added. But I can have a look, and I can send an answer together with slides and recording link, because honestly I haven't looked carefully. So it's a lot easier to register if you're only data repository, because then you can easily answer all the questions, questions specific to data repositories, but I think it's also possible to register institutional repositories with datasets.
Oh, okay. Right. Thank you very much, Iryna. Colleagues from Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, thank you all for coming and joining this webinar. As I said, it's being organized by CARLIGH. CARLIGH is a consortium of academic and research libraries in Ghana, in collaboration with EIFL, and the speaker is Iryna Kuchma, Open Access Program Manager from EIFL. Our next topic will be on Creative Commons, and then the next one, we have 2 more left for the year, Creative Commons and then the research assessment. Creative Commons, at this COVID times, many universities are doing online teaching and learning. So a lot of them too. And we also have a lot of open educational resources available online that people are just using. And there are Creative Commons licenses attached to them, but a lot of lecturers and faculty members may not understand the use of the essence of those Creative Commons. So there's going to be a webinar on that. So look out for that. The date will come out soon, and then the link will be shared on the EIFL platform. So at this time, I think we'll have to run up, and so maybe Iryna will run it up, and then we can close from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard and CARLIGH, and thanks a lot, colleagues, for joining today. Have a good afternoon, and I will email you slides and recording probably tomorrow, because it takes some time to upload the recording to YouTube. But thanks again, and thank you for your questions and feedback.
Thank you very much, EIFL, and thank you we are most grateful to Iryna for having this program. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon and good morning, wherever you are.